Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our darkest moments. What happens when a man's moment of rage collides with a woman trained to handle life and death situations? When Marcus Thompson's knee connected with Sarah Chen's temple outside a crowded nightclub, he thought he was just another angry man taking out his frustrations on someone smaller. He had no idea he was about to face a decorated Navy SEAL who would change his life forever. This isn't just a story about violence or revenge. It's about the unexpected power of mercy, the strength found in vulnerability, and how sometimes our worst mistakes can lead us to become the people we were always meant to be. What started as an assault in a dark alley became a journey that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Marcus Thompson had been drinking since 5 p.m. The termination letter from his construction job was still crumpled in his truck's glove compartment, and the eviction notice was taped to his apartment door back home. At 32, he felt like his entire world was falling apart, one piece at a time. The whiskey burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire of anger and humiliation burning in his chest. The downtown nightclub was packed with young professionals celebrating another Friday night. Marcus watched them through bloodshot eyes, their laughter and carefree attitudes making his stomach turn. These people had everything he'd lost. Good jobs, nice clothes, futures that seemed bright and certain. He'd been one of them once, before the economy crashed and construction work dried up, before his wife left him for someone with better prospects. Sarah Chen stood at the bar, still wearing her Navy uniform. She was on shore leave for just 3 days, visiting her hometown of Denver for the first time in 8 months. Her deployments had taken her to places most people couldn't imagine, where life and death decisions were made in seconds. Tonight, she just wanted to feel normal again, to remember what it was like to be a regular person, having a simple drink without scanning for threats or calculating escape routes. The bartender slid her a beer, and Sarah nodded her thanks. She'd chosen this particular spot because it was close to her hotel and seemed safe enough. The crowd was mostly young office workers, nothing that should set off her finely tuned danger senses. But 8 years in special operations had taught her that trouble could come from anywhere, at any time. Marcus had been watching her for 20 minutes. There was something about the way she carried herself that bothered him. Confident, sure of herself. Everything he wasn't anymore. She was attractive, that was obvious. But it was more than that. She looked like she belonged wherever she was, like the world owed her something good. The rational part of his mind knew his anger wasn't really about her, but the whiskey had long since silenced rationality. When Sarah finished her beer and headed for the exit, Marcus followed. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it didn't clear his head the way it should have. If anything, it made him angrier. Here he was, stumbling around like a drunk fool, while she walked with purpose toward whatever perfect life was waiting for her. The alley behind the club was poorly lit, illuminated only by a few scattered streetlights and the neon glow spilling from nearby businesses. Sarah had parked her rental car at the back of the lot, a decision she was already second-guessing as her training kicked in. The space was too isolated, too many blind spots. She quickened her pace slightly, her hand instinctively moving toward where her sidearm would normally rest. Marcus's footsteps echoed behind her, uneven but getting closer. Sarah had heard him leave the club after her, had seen his reflection in the storefront windows as she walked. Her muscles tensed as years of combat training flooded back. This wasn't paranoia, this was situational awareness that had kept her alive in hostile territory. When Marcus called out to her, his voice was slurred and aggressive. He wanted to talk, he said. Just talk. Sarah turned to face him, immediately assessing the threat level. Male, approximately 6 feet tall, probably 200 pounds. Intoxicated, agitated. Her training told her to de-escalate, to create distance, to avoid confrontation if possible. She told him calmly that she wasn't interested in talking, that she was leaving. Her voice was steady, professional, the same tone she'd used to give orders to her squad under fire. But Marcus heard rejection, heard the confidence of someone who thought they were better than him. The rage that had been building all day finally found its target. He moved faster than Sarah expected for someone in his condition. The knee came up hard and connected with the side of her head before she could fully react. The impact sent stars exploding across her vision, and she stumbled backward against her car. For a moment, the world tilted and blurred, and she found herself back in a dusty compound in Afghanistan, under attack and fighting for her life. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and Marcus Thompson wasn't an enemy combatant. As Sarah's training kicked in and the fog of impact cleared, she realized she was facing something much more complicated than anything she'd encountered in war. This was a broken man lashing out at a world that had hurt him, and she was just the nearest target. Marcus stood over her, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. The satisfaction he'd expected to feel didn't come. Instead, he felt sick. The woman wasn't cowering or crying the way he'd somehow expected. She was looking at him with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite anger. It was assessment, like she was deciding what to do with him. Sarah could have ended the confrontation in seconds. 8 years of close-quarters combat training had given her dozens of ways to neutralize the threat Marcus represented. She could have had him unconscious or disabled before he knew what hit him. Instead, she found herself seeing something in his eyes that she recognized from her own mirror during her darkest moments overseas. Pain. Deep, overwhelming pain that had nowhere else to go. The moment stretched between them in the dim alley light. Marcus's rage was already ebbing, replaced by the sick realization of what he'd done. Sarah remained crouched against her car, one hand pressed to her temple where his knee had connected, the other ready to defend herself if necessary. But instead of striking back, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, without any trace of the fear or anger Marcus expected to hear. She asked him if hitting her had made him feel better, if this was who he wanted to be. The questions cut through the whiskey fog in his brain like surgical strikes, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Marcus felt his legs go weak. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it came the crushing weight of what he'd just done. He'd attacked a woman in an alley. He'd become the kind of person he'd always despised, the kind of person his father had been when the drinking got bad. The realization hit him harder than any physical blow could have. Sarah watched him crumble, saw the exact moment when the rage collapsed into shame and self-loathing. She'd seen the same transformation in young soldiers who'd made terrible mistakes in the heat of combat, who suddenly understood the weight of their actions. It was a moment that could destroy a person completely or become the foundation for something better. She made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Instead of calling the police, instead of using her training to subdue him, instead of walking away and leaving him to deal with the consequences alone, Sarah Chen did something that Marcus Thompson never could have expected. She offered him her hand and asked if he was okay. Not whether she was okay after being assaulted, but whether he was okay. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside the script Marcus had written in his head for this encounter, that it broke something inside him. The tears came without warning, years of accumulated pain and frustration pouring out in great shuddering sobs. He found himself telling a complete stranger about losing his job, about his wife leaving, about feeling like a failure at everything he'd ever tried to do. Sarah listened without judgment, her back against the car, her hand still pressed to the growing bruise on her temple. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her shore leave, but something about this broken man reminded her of why she'd joined the military in the first place. Not to destroy people, but to protect them. Sometimes protecting people meant protecting them from themselves. When Marcus finally stopped talking, Sarah made him an offer that would echo through both their lives for years to come. She told him that everyone deserves a second chance, but they have to earn it. She told him that she saw something in him worth saving, but he had to want to save it too. And then she gave him her phone number and told him to call her when he was ready to start becoming the person he was meant to be. The alley fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and music from the club. Two strangers who should have been enemies stood facing each other in the dim light, both understanding that something profound had just happened. Marcus Thompson had committed assault and found mercy. Sarah Chen had been attacked and chosen compassion. Neither would ever be quite the same again. 3 days passed before Marcus found the courage to use the crumpled piece of paper with Sarah's phone number. 3 days of staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing his father's face looking back at him. 3 days of reliving that moment in the alley, feeling his knee connect with her temple over and over again in his nightmares. 3 days of wondering how someone could offer kindness to the person who had just hurt them. He'd thrown the paper away twice, digging it out of the trash both times with shaking hands. The shame was overwhelming, but it was mixed with something else he hadn't felt in months. Hope. She'd seen something in him worth saving, she'd said. He just had to want to save it too. The question that kept him awake at night was whether he was brave enough to try. Sarah had returned to her base in Virginia, but the encounter in Denver stayed with her in ways she hadn't expected. She'd faced enemy fire without flinching, had made split-second decisions that saved lives, had earned decorations for courage under pressure. But something about that broken man in the alley had shaken her more than any combat situation ever had. Maybe because his pain was so familiar. She'd grown up in a household where her father's drinking turned him into a stranger, where violence was as common as dinner conversation. She'd joined the Navy partly to escape that world, partly to prove she was stronger than the chaos that had defined her childhood. But Marcus Thompson had reminded her that running away from pain wasn't the same as healing from it. Sometimes healing meant staying and fighting for something better. When her phone rang on Wednesday evening, Sarah was in her quarters reviewing mission reports. She didn't recognize the number, but something made her answer anyway. The voice on the other end was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion and uncertainty. Marcus had practiced what he would say dozens of times, but when he actually heard her voice, all his prepared words disappeared. Instead, he found himself apologizing again, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and regret. He was sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry for bothering her. He was sorry for being the kind of person who would hurt someone smaller than him. He was sorry for existing. Sarah listened to him spiral into self-loathing and recognized the sound. She'd heard it from young soldiers who'd made mistakes in combat, who'd let their team down or compromised a mission. Self-hatred was easy. It was comfortable in its familiarity. Actually, changing was harder, scarier, and required a kind of courage that most people didn't know they possessed. She interrupted his apologies with a question that stopped him cold. What was he going to do about it? Sorry was just a word unless it was followed by action. If he really wanted to make amends for what he'd done, he needed to become someone who would never do it again. That meant facing the reasons behind his actions, not just the actions themselves. Marcus sat in his empty apartment, surrounded by empty beer bottles and unpaid bills, and realized she was right. He had been drowning his problems in alcohol for months, letting anger and self-pity consume him until there was nothing left but rage. Apologizing wouldn't undo the damage he'd done, but changing might prevent him from doing more. Sarah proposed something unprecedented. She was due for leave again in 6 weeks. If Marcus was serious about changing, she would spend that leave helping him figure out how, not as his therapist or his savior, but as someone who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from the ground up. She'd done it before, and she believed he could too. The conditions were non-negotiable. Marcus had to stop drinking completely. He had to find a job, any job, and stick with it. He had to start attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and most importantly, he had to want to change for himself. Not just because she'd asked him to. She wouldn't be responsible for fixing him, she'd just help him learn how to fix himself. Marcus agreed without hesitation, though he had no idea what he was signing up for. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of his life. Quitting alcohol, cold turkey, left him shaking and sick for days. Finding work as an ex-convict with a drinking problem seemed impossible until he finally swallowed his pride and took a job cleaning office buildings for minimum wage. The work was humbling, but it was honest, and it gave him something to focus on besides his problems. The AA meetings were torture at first, sitting in a circle with strangers, admitting his failures out loud, listening to stories that sounded too much like his own. But slowly, he began to understand that he wasn't alone in his struggle. Other people had hit bottom and climbed back up. Other people had hurt the ones they loved and found ways to make amends. Other people had rebuilt their lives from nothing. Sarah called him every few days to check in, but she didn't make it easy for him. She asked hard questions about his progress, challenged him when he made excuses, and refused to accept self-pity as an answer to anything. Her voice was the same steady professional tone she'd used in the alley, but now Marcus heard something else in it. Belief. She believed he could change, even when he didn't believe it himself. The first time Marcus completed a full week without drinking, he called to tell her. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, like a child who'd learned to ride a bicycle. Sarah found herself smiling as she listened to him describe how different food tasted when he wasn't hungover, how he'd actually enjoyed watching a sunrise on his way to work. 3 weeks in, Marcus had a breakdown. A coworker made a joke about his old beat-up work clothes, and the familiar rage flared up before he could stop it. For a moment, he wanted to hit something, to hurt someone, the way he'd been hurt. Instead, he locked himself in a bathroom stall and called Sarah's number with shaking hands. She talked him through the anger without minimizing it or telling him it was wrong to feel frustrated. Anger was normal, she said. Human. The key was learning how to channel it into something productive instead of destructive. She told him about her own struggles with rage during her early military training, how she'd learned to transform fury into focus, pain into purpose. By the time Marcus hung up, the immediate crisis had passed. But more importantly, he'd learned something valuable about himself. He could feel anger without acting on it. He could reach out for help instead of lashing out in violence. He could choose a different response than the one his emotions demanded. The physical training Sarah assigned him started simple. Push-ups, sit-ups, running around the block. But it wasn't about building muscle, it was about building discipline. Every morning, regardless of how he felt, Marcus forced himself to exercise. When he wanted to quit, he kept going. When his body ached, he pushed through the pain. When his mind told him he was wasting his time, he ignored it and did the work anyway. Gradually, Marcus began to understand what Sarah was teaching him. Change wasn't a moment of revelation. It was a series of small choices made over and over again. Every day he chose not to drink was a victory. Every shift at work he completed without losing his temper was progress. Every AA meeting he attended was another step away from the man who had attacked a stranger in an alley. The weight loss was just a side effect, but it was noticeable. The constant exercise and sobriety had stripped away the bloat and sluggishness that alcohol had created. Marcus found himself standing straighter, moving with more confidence. People at work began to treat him differently, with something approaching respect. His supervisor even mentioned the possibility of a promotion to a day shift position. 5 weeks after their first phone call, Marcus realized something that shocked him. He was happy. Not ecstatic, not manic, just quietly, steadily content. He liked his simple routine, liked the clarity that sobriety brought to his thoughts, liked the sense that he was moving forward instead of just drifting. For the first time in years, he was proud of who he was becoming. When Sarah called to confirm the details of her upcoming leave, Marcus almost didn't recognize his own voice. Gone was the broken, desperate man who had whispered apologies into the phone 6 weeks earlier. In his place was someone stronger, calmer, more sure of himself. The transformation wasn't complete. It might never be complete, but it was undeniable. Sarah heard the change immediately. There was confidence in his voice now, determination instead of desperation. He'd done exactly what she'd asked him to do, and more. He'd proven to himself that change was possible, that he could become someone better than his worst moment. Now came the real test. Could he maintain that progress when faced with the person he'd hurt? Could he look her in the eye and show her the man he was becoming instead of the man he'd been? The phone call ended with plans to meet at a coffee shop near the Denver airport. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would put either of them in a vulnerable position. Just two people who had shared an extraordinary moment, coming together to see what they might build from the wreckage of their first encounter. As Marcus hung up the phone, he looked around his small apartment. It was still modest, still furnished with second-hand furniture and decorated with hope rather than money. But it was clean now, organized, cared for. Like its occupant, it was becoming something better than what it had been. And that, Marcus realized, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Sarah arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained by years of military precision. She chose a table near the back, positioning herself with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. Old habits died hard, especially when meeting the man who had assaulted her 6 weeks earlier. No matter how much progress Marcus had made, no matter how much she believed in his capacity for change, her training wouldn't let her forget that he had once been a threat. She ordered black coffee and waited, her hands steady but her mind racing. This meeting could go dozens of different ways. Marcus might have relapsed. He might still be carrying anger and resentment. He might see this as an opportunity to finish what he'd started in that alley. Sarah's rational mind told her these scenarios were unlikely, given their phone conversations, but her survival instincts remained alert nonetheless. When Marcus walked through the door, Sarah almost didn't recognize him. The man who entered the coffee shop bore little resemblance to the drunk, enraged stranger who had attacked her. This person moved with purpose, his back straight, his eyes clear. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, and the weight loss had revealed sharp cheekbones and a strong jawline that had been hidden beneath alcohol-induced bloat. His clothes were simple but clean, pressed, chosen with care. But it was more than the physical transformation that caught Sarah's attention. The desperate energy that had surrounded Marcus that night was gone, replaced by something steadier and more grounded. He moved like someone who had found his center again, like someone who knew who he was and was comfortable in his own skin. Marcus spotted her immediately and paused at the entrance, his confidence wavering for just a moment. Seeing her again brought back the full weight of what he'd done, the memory of his knee connecting with her temple, the sound she'd made when she hit the car. The shame was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer threatened to consume him the way it once had. He approached her table slowly, giving her plenty of time to assess him, to decide if she felt safe. When he reached her table, he didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking at her directly for the first time since that night. The bruise he'd given her was long gone, but Marcus could still see exactly where it had been. Sarah gestured to the chair across from her, and Marcus sat down carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter the delicate trust they'd built through their phone conversations. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was weighted with the gravity of their shared history. Finally, Marcus broke the silence with two words that carried the weight of 6 weeks of transformation. Thank you. Not for forgiveness, not for a second chance, but for seeing something in him that he hadn't been able to see in himself. For believing that the worst thing he'd ever done didn't have to define who he became. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the man who had attacked her. The facial features were the same, but everything else had changed. His posture, his expression, the way he held himself, it was like looking at a completely different person. The transformation was so complete that it was almost unsettling. People didn't usually change this much this quickly, but then again, most people didn't hit rock bottom with such dramatic clarity. Marcus told her about the last 6 weeks in detail, not just the milestones she already knew about from their phone calls, but the small, daily struggles that had shaped his transformation. The morning he'd woken up craving alcohol so badly he'd driven to a liquor store and sat in the parking lot for 2 hours before driving home empty-handed. The evening he'd gotten his first paycheck and realized he could afford both rent and groceries for the first time in months. The night he'd called his ex-wife to apologize for the man he'd been during their marriage, not expecting forgiveness but needing to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that revealed how carefully she'd been thinking about his situation. She understood the psychology of change in ways that surprised Marcus. Her questions weren't just supportive, they were analytical, designed to test whether his transformation was genuine or whether he was simply telling her what she wanted to hear. When Marcus finished talking, Sarah shared something she hadn't mentioned during their phone calls. The night he'd attacked her wasn't the first time she'd been the target of a man's misplaced rage. Growing up with an alcoholic father had given her plenty of experience with unpredictable violence, with the way pain could twist people into monsters they never meant to become. The difference was that her father had never chosen to change. Marcus had. This revelation recontextualized everything for Marcus. Sarah's mercy in that alley wasn't just random kindness. It was the conscious choice of someone who understood his situation intimately. She'd seen the worst of what he could become because she'd lived with someone who had never chosen anything better. Her belief in his capacity for change came from hard-earned wisdom about the difference between someone who was broken and someone who was evil. They talked for 3 hours, the conversation flowing from heavy topics to lighter ones and back again. Sarah told him about her military service, about the challenges of being a woman in special operations, about the way combat had taught her to value strength and courage above all else. Marcus shared his dreams of returning to school, of maybe becoming a counselor himself someday, of using his experience to help other people who were struggling with addiction and anger. As the afternoon wore on, something unexpected happened. They began to enjoy each other's company. Beyond the dramatic circumstances of their meeting, beyond the weight of transformation and redemption, they discovered that they actually liked each other as people. They shared similar senses of humor, had complementary perspectives on life, and found themselves laughing together in a way that felt natural and unforced. When Sarah mentioned that she was staying in Denver for a full week, Marcus made a suggestion that surprised them both. He asked if she'd like him to show her around the city. Not as a date, not as anything romantic, but as someone who knew the area and wanted to return the kindness she'd shown him. Sarah's immediate instinct was to decline. This was already far outside the bounds of normal victim-perpetrator interaction, but something made her pause and consider the offer. The next day, they met at the Denver Art Museum. Marcus had never been inside, but he'd walked past it hundreds of times during his drinking days. Now, seeing it through Sarah's eyes, he discovered that his hometown had beauty he'd never noticed. They spent hours wandering through galleries, discussing pieces they liked and others that left them confused. Sarah's appreciation for abstract art revealed a complexity to her thinking that went far beyond her military training. Marcus's insights into the local artist's work showed a sensitivity he was only beginning to recognize in himself. Their second day together, they hiked in the mountains outside Denver. Sarah's physical fitness was extraordinary, unsurprising for a Navy SEAL. But Marcus managed to keep up. The 6 weeks of exercise had given him an endurance he hadn't possessed in years. As they climbed higher into the thin mountain air, they talked about their childhoods, their families, their fears and hopes for the future. At the summit, sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley below, Sarah asked Marcus a question that had been nagging at her since their first meeting. Why hadn't he hit her back after she offered to help him? She'd been vulnerable in that moment, emotionally and physically. If he'd truly been the monster he thought he was, that would have been the time to prove it. What had stopped him? Marcus thought for a long time before answering. He said that in the moment when she'd extended her hand to help him up, he'd seen his mother. Not literally, but the memory of her kindness, her unwavering belief that people could be better than their worst moments. She had died when he was 15, and he'd been disappointing her memory ever since. Sarah's gesture had reminded him of who he'd been raised to be, before alcohol and failure had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. The conversation revealed something profound about Marcus's character. Even at his lowest point, even in the grip of rage and alcohol, some fundamental part of him had remained intact. The core of who he was, the child his mother had raised, had been buried but not destroyed. Sarah's act of mercy hadn't created his capacity for goodness. It had simply reminded him that it still existed. Their third day together, they volunteered at a homeless shelter. It was Sarah's idea, but Marcus embraced it enthusiastically. Working together to serve meals and organize donations, they saw each other in yet another context. Sarah's natural leadership abilities were evident as she quickly organized the other volunteers into efficient teams. Marcus's patience and gentleness with the shelter residents revealed depths of compassion that he was still discovering in himself. One elderly man at the shelter reminded Marcus of his father in his final years, broken down by alcohol and poor choices. Instead of triggering anger or resentment, the encounter filled Marcus with sadness. For all the wasted potential, all the missed opportunities for connection and healing. He found himself wishing his father could have met someone like Sarah. Someone who saw possibilities instead of problems. That evening, as they sat in a small restaurant sharing dinner, Sarah made an observation that stunned Marcus. She said, he reminded her of the best officers she'd served under. People who had faced their own limitations and failures, and emerged stronger for the experience. True leadership, she said, came not from perfection, but from the courage to acknowledge mistakes and do better. Marcus had that courage in abundance. The compliment moved Marcus to tears. 6 weeks earlier, he had been the kind of person who attacked women in alleys. Now, someone he respected was comparing him to military leaders she admired. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, but the evidence was undeniable. He was becoming someone he could be proud of, someone his mother would have recognized and approved of. As the week progressed, their relationship evolved into something neither of them had expected. It wasn't romantic. The circumstances of their meeting made that impossible, at least for now. But it was profound in its own way. They'd become witnesses to each other's capacity for growth, partners in a kind of mutual transformation that transcended their original roles as victim and perpetrator. On their final evening together, they returned to the alley where they'd first met. Standing in the spot where Marcus had once attacked her, they marveled at how different everything looked now. The space that had once seemed threatening and isolated now felt like the birthplace of something beautiful and unexpected. They'd both been different people that night, and they'd both chosen to become something better. Sarah's flight was leaving early the next morning. As they said goodbye outside her hotel, Marcus thanked her again for seeing something worth saving in him. Sarah's response surprised him one final time. She said he'd given her something too, proof that her faith in human nature hadn't been misplaced, that mercy could indeed triumph over judgment, that people really could change if they wanted it badly enough. They hugged goodbye, a gesture that would have been unimaginable 6 weeks earlier, but felt perfectly natural now. As Sarah disappeared into the hotel lobby, Marcus walked back to his car, knowing that his life had been permanently altered by their week together. But more than that, he knew that the change was real, lasting, and entirely his own. Sarah had shown him the door, but he had been the one to walk through it. 6 months after Sarah returned to her base, Marcus was promoted to supervisor at the cleaning company. The recognition wasn't just for his reliable attendance or improved attitude, though both had been noticed by management. It was for his ability to connect with struggling employees, to see potential where others saw problems. His supervisor told him he had a gift for helping people believe in themselves, and Marcus couldn't help but smile at the irony. The promotion came with a significant pay increase and, more importantly, the opportunity to implement programs Marcus had been thinking about for months. He proposed a partnership with local addiction recovery centers, offering employment opportunities to people completing treatment programs. The company's executives were skeptical at first, but Marcus's own transformation served as a powerful example of what was possible when someone was given a real second chance. Sarah and Marcus maintained regular contact through video calls every few weeks. Their conversations had evolved from check-ins about his progress to genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. Sarah was completing advanced training in psychological operations, preparing for a leadership role that would keep her stateside for at least 2 years. The timing felt significant to both of them, though neither had explicitly discussed what it might mean. During one of their calls, Marcus mentioned that he'd enrolled in community college, taking night classes toward a degree in addiction counseling. The decision had been brewing since their week together in Denver, but it had taken months for him to believe he was worthy of pursuing such goals. Sarah's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She'd been waiting for him to realize what she'd seen in him from the beginning. The coursework was challenging but rewarding. Marcus found himself particularly drawn to classes on trauma recovery and family systems. Learning the scientific explanations for his own experiences helped him understand that his transformation hadn't been miraculous. It had been the result of specific, measurable changes in thinking patterns and behavior. This knowledge made his progress feel more solid, more permanent. One evening after class, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from his ex-wife, Jennifer. She'd heard about his changes through mutual friends and wanted to meet for coffee. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and important of Marcus's life. Jennifer had remarried and was genuinely happy, but she wanted to understand what had happened to the man she'd once loved and lost to alcohol and anger. Marcus told her everything. About that night in the alley, about Sarah, about the work he'd done to become someone different. Jennifer listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed how much thought she'd given to their failed marriage. When he finished, she said something that nearly broke his heart with its simple truth. The man sitting across from her was the person she'd married, the one who'd gradually disappeared into bottles and rage. Jennifer's forgiveness wasn't complete. Too much damage had been done for that, but it was real. She told Marcus she was proud of him for doing the hard work of change, proud that he'd found his way back to being the good man she'd always known existed underneath the pain. They parted that day not as potential reconcilers, but as two people who had finally found peace with their shared history. The encounter with Jennifer prompted Marcus to reach out to others he'd hurt during his drinking years. His brother David, who'd stopped returning his calls after Marcus had ruined Christmas dinner 2 years earlier with a drunken rant. His former best friend Tony, whose wedding Marcus had missed because he'd been too drunk to drive. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, whose flower garden he'd destroyed during one of his rage-filled episodes. Each conversation was difficult in its own way, but all of them ended better than Marcus had dared to hope. People could see the change in him, could hear the sincerity in his voice when he took responsibility for his actions. Most were willing to cautiously rebuild relationships they'd thought were permanently damaged. The process taught Marcus that making amends wasn't about earning forgiveness, it was about acknowledging harm and demonstrating change. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own challenges. Her new role in psychological operations required her to work with military personnel suffering from PTSD and combat stress. Many of her patients reminded her of Marcus in those early days. Intelligent, capable people who'd lost their way and needed someone to believe in their capacity for healing. Her experience with Marcus had taught her things that weren't covered in any manual about the power of strategic mercy and the importance of seeing potential rather than just problems. One of her patients was a young Marine named David, who'd been involved in a civilian casualty incident that had left him consumed with guilt and self-hatred. Traditional therapy had made little progress, and he was resistant to most forms of intervention. Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus's transformation and decided to try a different approach. Instead of focusing on David's trauma, she focused on his values. What kind of person did he want to be? What would his best self look like? What small steps could he take today to move in that direction? The approach was unconventional but effective. David began to respond when he realized Sarah wasn't trying to fix him. She was helping him fix himself. The success with David led to similar approaches with other patients, and soon Sarah was being consulted on difficult cases throughout the base. Her reputation as someone who could reach seemingly hopeless cases spread quickly through the military psychology community. She was invited to speak at conferences, to contribute to research papers, to train other therapists in her methods. What Sarah didn't tell her colleagues was that her techniques had been learned not in graduate school but in a coffee shop in Denver, watching a broken man rebuild himself one choice at a time. Marcus's transformation had taught her more about the psychology of change than years of formal training. Her success as a therapist was built on the foundation of their unlikely friendship. 1 year after their first meeting, Sarah surprised Marcus with a visit to Denver. She was attending a conference on trauma recovery and had arranged to spend an extra day in the city. Marcus picked her up at the airport, and she immediately noticed changes that their video calls hadn't captured. His confidence had solidified into something natural and unshakable. His eyes held a peace she'd never seen before. They spent the day revisiting places they'd gone during their first week together, but everything felt different now. The art museum, the mountain trails, the homeless shelter where they'd volunteered. All of these places held memories of who they'd been becoming. Now they were testimonies to who they'd become. At the homeless shelter, Marcus introduced Sarah to several men who were part of his employment program. Former addicts, ex-convicts, people who'd been written off by society but were now contributing members of the community. One of them, a man named Robert, pulled Sarah aside to tell her that Marcus had saved his life by giving him a job when no one else would. He had no idea about the irony of his statement, about the chain of salvation that had started in an alley with an act of unexpected mercy. That evening, they had dinner at an upscale restaurant, a far cry from the simple places they'd shared during their first week together. Marcus insisted on paying, a gesture that meant more to both of them than the expensive meal. He'd come so far from the man who couldn't afford groceries that the simple act of treating someone to dinner felt like a celebration of everything he'd accomplished. Over dessert, Sarah shared something she'd never told Marcus before. The night he'd attacked her had been the worst day of her military career. She'd just learned that her deployment was being extended, meaning she'd miss her grandmother's funeral. She'd come to that bar not to celebrate but to grieve, to feel sorry for herself, to question whether the sacrifices of military life were worth it. His attack could have been the final straw, the thing that broke her faith in humanity completely. Instead, his transformation had renewed her belief in the power of change, in the possibility of redemption, in the idea that broken people could become beautiful. His journey had given her back her sense of purpose, her conviction that the work she was doing mattered. The conversation shifted to their futures. Marcus was graduating from his counseling program in 6 months and had already been offered a position at a treatment center specializing in anger management. Sarah's assignment would be ending soon, and she was considering taking a position as a civilian contractor that would give her more flexibility in where she lived. They didn't make any promises that night, didn't discuss the possibility of building something together. But the foundation was there, a deep mutual respect, shared values, and the knowledge that they'd both been transformed by their collision with each other. Whatever the future held, they'd both be better people for having known each other. As Sarah prepared to leave Denver again, she and Marcus made plans that felt different from their usual goodbyes. Instead of talking about when they might see each other again, they talked about what they wanted to build with their lives. Both had discovered purposes larger than themselves, Marcus in helping other people recover from addiction and anger, Sarah in developing new approaches to trauma recovery. Their individual missions were connected by the same thread that had bound them together from the beginning, the belief that broken people could heal, that mercy could triumph over judgment, that everyone deserved a chance to become their best self. They'd both found their callings in the wreckage of their worst moment together. Standing in the same alley where they'd first met, now transformed by the lights of urban development into a safer, brighter space, they marveled at how much had changed. The physical space was different, the people were different, even the air felt different. Everything grows and changes given enough time and care, Sarah observed. Everything can become something better than what it was. Marcus nodded, thinking about the man he'd been 2 years ago and the person he was now. The change felt so complete that sometimes he struggled to remember what it had felt like to live in that constant state of anger and pain. But he never forgot the lesson Sarah had taught him that first night. Everyone deserves a second chance, but they have to earn it. And earning it never stops. It's a choice that has to be made fresh every single day. As they parted ways that night, both knew that their story was far from over. They'd started as victim and perpetrator, evolved into teacher and student, and had become something rarer and more valuable. Two people who'd helped each other discover the best versions of themselves. Whatever came next would be built on that unshakable foundation of transformation and mutual respect. 2 years after Marcus graduated from his counseling program, he was invited to speak at the annual conference of the National Association for Addiction Recovery. The invitation had come as a surprise. He was still relatively new to the field, still building his reputation as a therapist who specialized in working with court-mandated clients who'd committed violence while under the influence. But his success rate with seemingly hopeless cases had drawn attention from across the country. Sarah was in the audience that day, having arranged her work schedule specifically to hear him speak. She'd heard him practice parts of his presentation during their video calls, but she wanted to see him in this setting, addressing a room full of professionals who had no idea about the extraordinary circumstances of his own recovery. Marcus took the stage with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. He was wearing a well-tailored suit, his posture straight and commanding, his voice clear and strong. But more than his physical presence, there was an authority about him that came from lived experience. He wasn't just someone who'd studied addiction and recovery. He was someone who'd walked through the fire and emerged transformed. His presentation was titled Beyond Rock Bottom, When Crisis Becomes Catalyst. He began not with statistics or theories, but with a story. He told the room about a night when a desperate man had attacked a stranger in an alley, and how that stranger's response had changed two lives forever. He didn't reveal Sarah's identity or military background, but he painted a vivid picture of the choice she'd made to respond to violence with mercy. The audience was captivated. These were people who'd seen every form of addiction and recovery, who thought they'd heard every possible story of transformation. But Marcus's account of his own journey challenged their assumptions about what was possible when someone truly committed to change. His success wasn't just personal, it was professionally revolutionary. Marcus explained his approach to working with violent offenders, an approach built on the principles Sarah had demonstrated that first night. See the person, not just the problem. Believe in change even when the client doesn't believe in it themselves. Set clear expectations and hold people accountable, but never give up on their capacity for growth. Challenge them to become someone they can be proud of. The results spoke for themselves. Marcus's recidivism rate was less than 10%, compared to a national average of over 60% for violent offenders. His clients weren't just staying out of jail, they were rebuilding their lives, repairing relationships, finding purpose and meaning. They were proving that the worst thing someone had ever done didn't have to define who they became. During the question and answer session, a therapist from Chicago asked Marcus about his own motivation. What drove him to work with the most difficult cases, the clients that other counselors often avoided? Marcus's answer was simple but profound. Someone had once seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself. Now, it was his responsibility to pass that gift forward. After the presentation, Marcus was surrounded by colleagues wanting to learn more about his methods. Conference attendees lined up to exchange contact information, to invite him to speak at their facilities, to collaborate on research projects. The man who had once felt worthless was now being recognized as a leader in his field. Sarah waited until the crowd thinned before approaching him. When Marcus saw her, his professional composure cracked just slightly, revealing the genuine warmth and affection that existed beneath his public persona. They embraced briefly, a gesture of friendship and mutual pride that spoke volumes about the journey they'd shared. Over dinner that evening, they caught up on the developments of the past few months. Sarah had officially transitioned to civilian work and was now the director of a new trauma recovery center that integrated military and civilian approaches to healing. Her techniques, refined through years of working with both veterans and crime victims, were being adopted by treatment facilities across the country. Marcus told her about his latest project, a residential program for men who'd committed domestic violence. The program was controversial, with many advocates arguing that resources should go to victims rather than perpetrators. But Marcus had convinced administrators that preventing future violence was ultimately the best way to protect potential victims. His track record gave him credibility that few others in the field possessed. The conversation eventually turned to their personal lives. Sarah had been dating someone, a fellow therapist who shared her commitment to helping people heal from trauma. Marcus had been in a relationship too, with a woman named Elena who worked as a social worker and understood the demands of his calling. Neither relationship had turned into something permanent, but both had been meaningful steps toward building complete, balanced lives. What struck both of them was how normal their lives had become. 4 years ago, they'd been two people trapped by their circumstances, Marcus by his addiction and anger, Sarah by the isolation of her military career. Now they were thriving professionals with fulfilling work, healthy relationships, and bright futures. The extraordinary had become ordinary through the simple passage of time and consistent effort. Their dinner was interrupted by a young man who approached their table hesitantly. He was clearly struggling with something, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He'd been in the audience for Marcus's presentation and recognized him from the conference program. He wanted to thank Marcus for what he'd said about second chances and transformation. The young man, David, had been court-ordered to attend the conference as part of his own recovery process. He'd assaulted his girlfriend during an argument 6 months earlier and was facing jail time unless he could demonstrate genuine change. He'd been skeptical about the possibility of real transformation until he heard Marcus speak. Now he was wondering if there might be hope for someone like him. Marcus invited David to sit down, and for the next hour, they talked about the real work of change. Marcus was honest about how difficult it would be, the daily choice to be better, the need to face the pain beneath the anger, the requirement to make amends even when forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. But he was also encouraging about what was possible when someone truly committed to the process. Sarah watched the conversation with fascination. She was seeing Marcus use the same approach with David that she'd used with him 4 years earlier. See the person, not just the problem. Believe in change even when the client doesn't believe in it themselves. Challenge them to become someone they can be proud of. The circle was completing itself in real time. When David left, he had Marcus's contact information and a list of concrete steps he could take immediately. More importantly, he had hope. The belief that his worst moment didn't have to define his future. Sarah and Marcus sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the significance of what had just happened. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from David. He'd completed an intensive anger management program, moved out of his mother's house, and found steady work as a carpenter's apprentice. He was attending AA meetings regularly and had begun making amends to the people he'd hurt. Most importantly, he was building a relationship with his young daughter, whom he'd been forbidden to see after the assault. The letter was filled with gratitude, but also with pride in what David had accomplished through his own effort. The letter arrived on the 4th anniversary of Marcus and Sarah's first meeting. They'd planned to spend the day together in Denver, a tradition they'd maintained every year since Marcus's recovery began. This year felt different though, less like commemorating a trauma and more like celebrating a triumph. They returned to the alley where it all began, now bustling with activity from the coffee shops and art galleries that had moved into the gentrified neighborhood. Standing in the exact spot where Marcus had once attacked her, Sarah reflected on how their story had rippled outward, in ways they never could have imagined. Marcus's recovery had inspired his brother David to address his own drinking problem. Jennifer, his ex-wife, had become an advocate for rehabilitation programs after seeing Marcus's transformation. The employment program he'd started had helped dozens of formerly homeless and addicted individuals find stability and purpose. Each person he'd helped in his counseling practice had gone on to impact other lives in positive ways. Sarah's career had been shaped by the lessons she'd learned from Marcus's recovery. Her trauma recovery center was now training therapists from around the world in her innovative approaches to healing. She'd published papers that changed how the military handled PTSD treatment. She'd helped hundreds of people discover their own capacity for post-traumatic growth. But perhaps most importantly, they'd both learned to see the potential for good in places where others saw only problems. Their shared experience had given them a unique perspective on human nature, an understanding that people's worst moments often spring from their deepest pain, and that healing that pain could transform monsters back into human beings. As the sun set over Denver, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah and Marcus walked through the city where their lives had intersected so dramatically. They talked about their work, their relationships, their dreams for the future. But mostly, they marveled at the unpredictable nature of grace. How mercy offered at the right moment could change everything. Their friendship had evolved into something rare and precious. They were connected not by romance or family ties, but by the shared knowledge of what human beings could become when they chose to grow rather than surrender to their circumstances. They'd been each other's salvation in different ways. Marcus learning that he was worthy of mercy, Sarah discovering that mercy itself was a form of strength. The evening ended at the coffee shop where they'd had their first real conversation. Over dessert and coffee, Sarah asked Marcus a question that had been on her mind for months. If he could go back and change that night in the alley, would he? The question was hypothetical but important. Was he grateful for the journey that had brought him to this point, even though it had begun with violence? Marcus thought for a long time before answering. He said he wouldn't change the transformation that had come from that night, but he deeply regretted that Sarah had to be hurt for it to happen. He wished he could have found another way to hit rock bottom, another catalyst for change that didn't involve harming an innocent person. But given that it had happened, he was grateful every day for her choice to respond with mercy instead of justice. Sarah nodded, understanding his conflicted feelings about their origin story. She'd struggled with similar questions. Whether she'd been naive to help him, whether she'd enabled dangerous behavior, whether her mercy had been wisdom or foolishness. But looking at the man across from her, seeing the lives he'd changed and the good he'd brought into the world, she knew she'd made the right choice. As they prepared to part ways that evening, both understood that their story had become bigger than just their personal transformation. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, proof that mercy could triumph over judgment, evidence that people really could change when someone believed in their capacity for growth. Marcus was now considered an expert in rehabilitation and recovery, sought after by institutions across the country. Sarah had become a leader in trauma therapy, revolutionizing treatment approaches for both military and civilian populations. But their greatest achievement wasn't professional recognition. It was the knowledge that they'd helped each other discover the best versions of themselves. Standing outside the coffee shop, they hugged goodbye with the easy affection of old friends. After 4 years of rebuilding themselves and their relationship, They both sensed that a new chapter was beginning. They were no longer just victim and perpetrator who'd found healing together. They were two whole, healthy people who'd discovered something beautiful in the wreckage of their worst moment. As they drove away in opposite directions, both Marcus and Sarah carried with them the certainty that their story was proof of something profound about human nature. People could change. Mercy could transform monsters, love could grow in the most unlikely places. And sometimes, the very thing that seems destined to destroy us becomes the foundation for everything beautiful that follows. The alley where it all began was now well lit and safe, lined with thriving businesses and filled with people living their ordinary, extraordinary lives. But for those who knew how to look, it still held the echo of a miracle, the moment when two strangers chose healing over hatred and proved that even the darkest nights could become the dawn of something wonderful.